Well, good morning, everyone. I think you know who I am. I'm Jonathan Roberts, and you've known me principally as a C.S. Lewis person. But 2 years ago, I decided to read the 11 volumes, Will and Ariel Durant's 11-volume Story of Civilization. So every month I read a book. And I fell in love with Will Durant, and I fell in love with Ariel Durant. And then every Sunday, I read the New York Times Book Review. And at the front, they always have an interview with an author. And so I was reading, this question. You're organizing a literary dinner party. Which 3 writers, dead or alive, do you invite? And so I said, well, if ever I were asked that question, I would invite Will and Ariel Durant and C.S. Lewis and Joy Davidman. And so I thought about it. These are the books that I'm referencing in the stack. This is my little office. So that's basically a partial stack of Lewis to the left. Those are the 11 volumes of Durant. As I like to say, the most quoted, least read books probably in most people's libraries. And then a few of the autobiographies that I read of his as well. And it's too bad they're not read because they're fabulous books. And the thing that is interesting about Durant, and the reason that I think it would be such an interesting dinner party, is Durant was the foremost atheist of the first half of the 20th century. And so he was very vocal about it, a stance he came to regret in his 80s. He wished he had been a little less vocal about it. And of course, Lewis is the most notable Christian apologist of the 20th century. And so it's fascinating to think that these minds would come together. What's even, I think, make it more interesting and spicier would be Ariel Durant is a complete hoot. She is so funny and so engaged. She's essentially Will's straight man, right? They're just going back and forth. And if anybody wants to hear them, they've done some fabulous interviews that are recorded on YouTube and a voice interview that is, I think, actually much better. And so you can hear the interplay. And then, of course, Joy Davidman is an intellectual force in her own right. I think that Deborah Winger did a great job. I don't know those of you that saw Shadowlands. Anthony Hopkins is Lewis, not so much. But Winger is Joy Davidman, just great. So a note, because most people really don't know about Will and Ariel Durant anymore. It's amazing how they dominated the intellectual landscape for so many decades, and now they're not really known. So there was a video produced called by the Passionate Mind Institute, and it opens with the narrator saying, "If knowledge is power, as the popular adage states, then this elderly, soft-spoken couple are perhaps the 2 most powerful people to ever walk our planet." That's what they thought of these people in 1970, 71, 72. And so you have to imagine, look at those books. The books span our Oriental heritage, which is sort of pre-history, all the way up through Napoleon. They worked on these books 14 hours a day for 40 years. They traveled the world 3 times. It's a little bit like Robert Caro on steroids. He's the one that did the LBJ biographies. And the premise would be, Lewis is known, of course, for his Christian work, but his principal academic work was the Oxford History of English Literature for the 16th century. For that work, he read 5,000 books. He references 1,000 books in the work itself. So the premise is that there's a dinner party. Since Lewis and Joy only took 1 plane ride in their lives, or Joy took many, Lewis only took 1 to go to Greece in 1960 with Joy, and Durant's traveled the world 3 times. I'm assuming it has to be at Oxford, and I'm assuming it's probably at the Lewis home, which is the Kilns. And at the top are Will and Ariel, and then there's Joy Davidman and C.S. Lewis. So I'm assuming it's at their house. If you want to get the detail of the setting, I've produced it. This is the creative brief. This is what I wrote. It's about 20 pages. And I don't know if you know what a creative brief is, but it's what you write to give to someone that creates an ad. Or, it talks about tone and manner, characters, objectives of it, key points, that kind of thing that informs what would then be a play. And I was going to make copies and hand it out, but Sandra Darling told me I had so many grammatical errors that I shouldn't circulate it. So if you're interested, send me an email, and once it's benefited from Sandra's good work, which is truly good work, and stuff that AI did not catch, I'll note, or Grammarly, you'll see it. But this is the dinner party, and that's the setting. I didn't put in all the voices of Joy and Ariel, and I should. But so it's principally, I'm going to speak mostly from Will's voice and Lewis's voice. Let me see what else is. Oh, a couple quotes I pulled. In the foreword of Smoke on the Mountain, which was Joy's book, Lewis described joy as this: the union of passionate heart with an intelligence which in that passion still modifies and distinguishes the tempers. Isn't that just great? And the other aspect of it that I would want to note is how respectful this would be. When you read that column, in the book review, they put authors together that would hate each other or speak different languages or from entirely different millennium. And it was like, how the hell is that going to work, right? This would actually be a great dinner party because these people respected the other's point of view. So we're going to talk a little bit about Durant, but he had profound respect for Christianity and religion in general. Lewis, up until the age of 30, essentially had held Durant's position. He understood Durant's position. That's why he's a Christian apologist, because he understands the other argument. But they would be gracious. They would be respectful. The other thing I would note is that Durant, he references Goethe many, many times. This is what I honestly think should be on every classroom wall. The great Goethe quote, which is that a man's errors are common to him with his epic, but his virtues or insight are his alone. Isn't that great? A man's errors are common to his epic. Their virtues are his alone. So I think we could complain a lot of things, some things that Lincoln did and said in words we won't even reference. But he had some virtues. I mean, let's give the guy some, the same could be said for a lot of people. So that was Durant's mindset. Deeply respectful, non-judgmental, tremendously informed. So I want to talk about the spiritual lens. So Chesterton called it the frame. He said the most interesting part of a picture is the frame. And I was like, that's odd. But the lens is the way that we process information. We have consciousness. We all absorb information. We process that information in our minds within a certain construct that we see. Everybody has a spiritual lens. Another great Chesterton quote is that it's not that atheists don't believe anything, it's that they'll believe almost anything. It's to believe everything, right? Because you can't help it. You have to wait how you're going to process information. And so when I was thinking about these two and thinking about the play and thinking about my grammatically afflicted creative brief, I wanted to start with what is their lens? What is the orientation through which they're processing information and from which they'll speak? And so with that, here is my view of Durant's spiritual lens. First, that is the sign of the Jesuits. He was deeply informed by the Jesuits. He loved the Jesuits. His mother was fiercely Catholic. And so he actually kind of drifted in by default into the priesthood. And there's some great, in his first autobiography, talk about a great historian. How many historians do you know have written 3 autobiographies, right? And And it's not an ego thing. What it reflects is that people wanted to read them, right? And he did it over a span of 60 years. So, but in his first one, Transitions, he dedicated it to, quote, a tender mother and a perfect father. And then he said of his mother, it was her intent to, quote, make a saint of one of us, and tried her best to inoculate me with every virtue. He wrote that in 1927. And then he was deeply influenced by his childhood priest, who came to take religious seriously again. The Mass became a vivid drama to me, and I saw the crucifixion anew at every elevation of the host. I prayed so fervently that people took it for granted that I would become a saint. So he was a deep, deep Christian, but he said he never really felt it in his heart. It was always, so we're going to contrast that with Lewis, which wasn't raised in the church, really, even though he had a grandfather that was a minister. But he felt this yearning. Durant was raised in the church and occasionally felt the passion, but never deeply inside. So there's always these interesting contrasts. He then started to read Darwin, Shelley, Byron, and he came to feel that belief and reason were incompatible. And after a night of reading heretical literature, I think Darwin, he fell out of belief. Quote, dimly I saw my faith slipping from me, saw myself left standing as if naked on some lonely shore with the darkness falling around me. He later said, I did not want to abandon the church. I loved the fair creed that had given me the story of Jesus and the gentle face of the Virgin. I liked every priest I had met and remembered gratefully the kindness of nuns. I did not want to lose my father's respect nor my mother's love. I begged God to tell me how to answer these books, how to be strong against this blasphemous poetry. But, quote, his prayers were useless. My conscience, but then he talks about how he fell out. So this is really just this. He fell out, one, because of Eros. He fell in love with this woman named Esther. And it turns out that falling in love with a woman is sort of incompatible with being a Jesuit priest. And he later talks about, in his later books, his last biography, he mentions he was also going out to burlesque shows. So let's just say he was conflicted. My conscience was with my mother, but all the rest of me yearned for the sight of Esther's smile. And so he fell out of belief. It had dissolved in the light of knowledge and the heat of love. But Ariel later said that he was a Catholic from the neck down, in terms of his practice. So this is Spinoza, the most influential philosopher that deeply impacted him. And Spinoza, spoke of sort of life force. He was Jewish, and sort of this image of God that then deeply influenced the Romantics, which obviously influenced him. And then that's Darwin. So he came to see these fundamental incompatibilities between reason and belief, between mysticism, the East, what he would call the Oriental religions, and the rationalism of the West. So, sort of Socrates as opposed to, the mystical religions of India. So he found all of these divisions. Lewis, on the other hand, did not, and this is why they're so interesting. So I will start off to the right with the grass growing. It's hard to find really good Google images of grass growing, I just want to note. But if you recall, in Surprised by Joy, Lewis's first glimpse of joy is grass growing in a little box. And he felt a yearning when he saw that. And he quotes, a vague desire, which was at the outset my only pointer to heaven. I could have seen no connection at all between that desire and the Christian promise. So when you think about Lewis, it's this yearning, it's this sense that keeps pulling him forward. You then have Dr. Kirkpatrick, who is known as the Great Knock. So Lewis had this, his mother died young. His father sent him off to boarding schools, which he hated. If you read Surprised by Joy, boarding schools get like 3 chapters, World War I gets a half chapter, right? He really had a bad experience. His dad pulls him and sends him to the Great Knock, who had been his father's tutor. The Great Knock was an atheist, an intellectual atheist. And so under the Great Knock, Lewis expunged all of his childhood belief and fell out of his faith. If you want to know who Kirkpatrick is, he is Professor Kirk in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It is Lewis reimagining the Great Knock if he had found belief. So isn't that great? Don't they teach these children, in school? Don't they read Plato? Remember that, the opening scene? Then you have Phantastes, which Lewis discovered at the train station leaving the Great Knock. George MacDonald, and then he credits MacDonald with baptizing his imagination. So there's something. Then he also later wrote, everything I have written has been influenced by George MacDonald. And I used to think that was just false praise. But when you read MacDonald and you read Lewis, you see tons of MacDonald in Lewis. Lewis is a little bit more digestible, which is why we're reading Lewis and not MacDonald. But the mystery, the wonder, the appeal to the imagination, that is MacDonald. And Lewis, as you would say, fell through the library and into this wondrous land with MacDonald. That's Chesterton. He discovered Chesterton when he was convalescing, when he had been injured by actually a friendly shell and was convalescing. And he was drawn to Chesterton because of his essential goodness. And then Chesterton's Everlasting Man was Mere Christianity prior to Lewis writing Mere Christianity. It's what everybody read for a unified view of Christianity was Everlasting Man. Read the second part, not the first, but anyway. And so then here are the Inklings. That's Lewis, Tolkien, Owen Barfield, and Charles Williams. But there's other Inklings. Dyson was tremendously influential as well to Lewis developing his mind. So I want to note a couple differences. When I really think about Durant and Lewis, Durant's spiritual lens was largely formed in his 20s. He married Ariel, actually when she was 15, a little awkward, but a little bit more common then, if you recall, Eberhard Becky, the famous biographer of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, mailed his wife when she was 15, right? So it was a little disjointed for us. I digress. But his spiritual lens was largely formed. And then they didn't respond to their massive amounts of correspondence. They worked 14 hours a day, and they did this thing. Lewis, I would suggest to you, had an open system. He argued with these guys for 7 years. He disagreed with these guys. Owen Barfield, he had a great statement, said, he's read all the right books and drawn all the wrong answers. He called him his second friend. It's Owen Barfield that got rid of his historical snobbery, that allowed him to accept as insight our predecessors versus throwing everything out and just saying what we happen to think today is the truth. And so the difference between Lewis and Durant, in my view, is open versus closed and deep engagement with people that challenged him. So a couple Lewis quotes that are just so great. And this isn't Surprised by Joy. The fox had been dislodged from the Hegelian wood and was now running in the open with all the woo in the world. Bedraggled and weary, hounds barely a field behind, and nearly everyone was now one way or the other in the pack. Plato, Dante, MacDonald, Herbert, Barfield, Tolkien, Dyson, and Joy itself. 1929, he fell to the floor and became the most reluctant Christian in England. I gave in and admitted that God was God, perhaps that night, quote, the most dejected and reluctant convert in all England. And then in Surprised by Joy, he awoke, he started the ride at the beginning of the ride. He did not believe in the divinity of Christ. At the end of the ride, he did. Nothing happened during the ride. So 2 years later, after talking to Dyson and Tolkien, he came to believe. And then this is a great quotation that isn't referenced all that much because it's in a slightly obscure essay. I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not because I see it, but because I see everything else through it. Actually, that was, theology is poetry. I believe in Christianity not because I've seen it, but because I see everything else through it. He just precisely described his spiritual lens and how he arrived at his spiritual lens. So here we have these two people, very different spiritual lenses, very good people, very articulate people, very respectful people. What are some of the topics they would discuss? And it wouldn't be casual topics. I actually think in the play, I have Warnie, Lewis's brother, stumbling along behind, because Warnie was an alcoholic and lived in the Inklings with them. And I think that would have taken them to a deeper level. And I think that there's some hardship in the Durant's life, not the least of which is that Ariel, when they first got married, felt so abandoned, she ended up getting herself arrested and institutionalized until she got out. And another brief aside, I mean, that was an interesting relationship. When Will was dying and going to the hospital for the last time, Ariel stopped eating and basically starved herself to death and died 2 weeks before Will died in the hospital. So if you want to understand the obsessive nature of Eros, not mediated through agape love, read the Four Loves, that's it, right? That's not having a context beyond the individual to whom you're connected. But anyway, so I mean, and also Ariel and Lewis were born the same year. Ariel and Joy were both Jewish. So there are lots of endless possibilities for a playwright. So here are some of the questions. What is it to be human? So this is the classic march. We've kind of lost the man on the other side, but it looks a little bit like us. And actually, you know, it's super cool. So I did all these slides, and then we put it through Microsoft Copilot, and it did all the colorization and all the framing. So I did not spend hours and hours doing this. I did these basic slides, and boom, here it is. But it's not perfect. Not like Sandra is perfect with her grammar. So Durant just felt we were evolved animals. And he describes basically the following, and this was in his first book, Our Oriental Heritage. Humans also remain unchanged. They fight, mate, rule, transact, entertain, create, and die according to the social construct within which they live. He further says, surely there is nothing new under the sun, and the difference between the first woman and the last could pass through the eye of a needle. We are evolved animals. Lewis, on the other hand, and this is interesting, right? So this is to represent spirituality. Lewis believed, and I think as Christians, we believe we're animal and spiritual. We're combined. Chesterton called that the new man. And so Lewis describes this the best in the Screwtape Letters. Humans are amphibians. Now, keep in mind Screwtape, right? So he's speaking in the negative because he's the devil trying to tempt the junior devil, Wormwood. So don't be dismayed that everything's opposite. Humans are amphibians, half spirit and half animal. The enemy's determination to produce such a revolting hybrid was one of the things that determined our father, the devil, to withdraw his support from him. As spirits, they belong to the eternal world, but as animals, they inhabit time. And then he later notes in a different letter that he, God, really loves the hairless bipeds. So we're amphibians, half spirit, half animal. And so also in the Screwtape Letters, he encourages us essentially the following, right? To remain in the present. What God wants us to do is remain in the present connected to eternity. Right? Because if you were to do Taoism, it would be Depression lies from living in the past. Anxiety lies from living in the future. Only peace lies from living in the present. You add the Christian construct, and it's connected to eternity. So that is Lewis's view, and that's their different views of what it is to be human. I keep looking at Elizabeth, trying to determine if she wants me to move to the next slide or not. So there's a lot going on. Is morality based on truth? And I think more fundamentally, is there truth? So, this is Pontius Pilate, that's Christ, right? Remember the great, when he said, is there truth? I tell you the truth. And Pilate's like, is there truth? I think that was an honest question. Because in the Roman construct, there wasn't such a notion of external truth. There was power. And so this notion of truth was kind of a bizarre notion. I would argue today that plays out. Is there truth? The editor of NPR said, not sure. And it's a question. And so I would argue that if you don't believe there's external truth and you only have relative truth, what is driving the perception of truth? Sort of that's what Lewis always does, is he plays the counter-argument. And Lewis felt the opposite, that there is something external to us and that we orient ourselves around it. So let's take a few other quotes. Durant. Every vice was once a virtue, necessary in the struggle for existence. It is one purpose of a moral code to adjust the unchanged or slowly changing impulses of human nature to the changing needs and circumstances of social life. He also quotes Anatole France, the French journalist and novelist who died in 1924, saying that morality is the sum of the prejudice of a community. That he finally believes that, so he believes that morality and those prejudices shift with a society, but where they come out together is Durant fully believed that we are warranted in concluding that the morals are relative and yet indispensable. So he believes that the morals are relative, but they're indispensable. In his last biography, he said the greatest thing, so he's writing this in the 1970s, the greatest threat to our Western society was not the Soviet Union. It was the collapse of the Christian church in Europe. He's writing this as an atheist because they were losing their moral code. They were losing the basis upon which they structure their society. He further writes, now I'm going to switch to Lewis. The rule of right and wrong, or law of human nature, or whatever you call it, must somehow be, or other, a real thing, a thing that is really there, not made up by ourselves. A few sentences later, there is something above and beyond the ordinary facts of men's behavior, and yet quite definitely real, a real law which none of us made, but which we find pressing on towards us. And Lewis felt that every society, not just Christian society, it's like gravity. If it's there, everything will be oriented towards it. And this is how he explains the commonality of the golden rule in every culture. Walk in someone else's moccasins, right? That our Native American predecessors were not reading Plato, right? And that you would have it in India, that you would have it in every culture. How is that? There is no explanation for that. And I've listened to Dawkins, and I've read Harari, and I've read Pinker. There's no explanation for that. The best treatment of this Lewis has in The Abolition of Man. He uses the Chinese word Tao to discuss the reality beyond predicates, the abyss that was before the Creator himself. It is not an exclusively Christian concept, but includes all its forms, Platonic, Aristotelian, Stoic, Christian, and Oriental alike. It is the doctrine of objective value and the belief that certain attitudes are really true and others really false to the kind of thing the universe is and the kind of thing we are. If you want to read the most ecumenical treatment across multiple different eternal truths, read the appendix of The Abolition of Man. And Lewis goes through ancient Babylonian, ancient Egyptian, all the monotheistic religions across a half dozen topics. And it's upon that he bases the belief that there is external truth. And I personally find that compelling. Does God exist? I know that if all of us were at that cocktail party right about now, we'd be thinking, can I have another drink? This is a little heavy lifting. This is hard. But I think these guys would talk about it. And I think they would talk about it in multiple languages. And they would quote, Durant taught Latin and Greek, and of course Lewis spoke Greek and Icelandic and everything else. And they did all this without computers. It's insane. So this is trying to capture the life force. So this is Durant on the left. And at the end of his life, he said this: "This, then, is the God I worship, the persistent and creative life that struggles up from the energy of the atom to make earth green with growth, to stir the youth with ambition and the girl with tender longing, to mold the form of a woman, to agitate genius, to guide the art of Phidias, and to justify itself in Spinoza and Christ. I know that there are other aspects of reality than this life, that nature is rich in terrors as well as in beauty and development. All the more should I reverence and help all growing things. This is a very old philosophy, otherwise I would distrust it." He goes on to say that he doesn't believe in a personal God, but wants to keep the name and associate it with the inventive vitality and abounding fertility of nature. He finally concludes, "Let me have something to worship." So he felt this need, a need that Lewis would call life force, right? Remember Mere Christianity, all the benefits of religion with none of the cost. Lewis hated the life force notion, so that is what they would discuss. And he also, I think, would have resonated with Goethe's religion was the adoration of nature and a desire to collaborate with her creative forces, her multiform productivity, and her obstinate perseverance, right? So that is Durant. Lewis, these are all these religious symbols, and it's largely what I talked about, which is if there's something external, then these religions would be oriented towards it. I also think that a book that I would highly recommend is Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sacks' book, The Dignity of Difference, that he wrote in 2001, where he talks about the similarity of religions, that we are all trying to arrive at the same truth, but by speaking different accents. So think about a language, right? And you can, if you think about it, wow, you can learn about your own language by understanding other languages and other perspectives. And Lewis in Mere Christianity said that there's truth in multiple religions, but it's like mathematics. You can be wrong in varying degrees. But he was deeply respectful. This is what he also said in a letter edited by Walter Hooper, which I see that I misspelled. Sanders, right. "It is only since I have become a Christian that I have learned really to value the elements of truth in paganism and idealism. I wish to value them more in the old days. Now I really do. Don't suppose I ever thought myself that certain elements of pantheism were incompatible with Christianity or with Catholicism." Next question. Myth, a story, or a pointer towards truth? And Durant, that's, fact or myth, right? When we say, hey, that's a myth, I think in our minds we're thinking that's not true, right? A myth is the opposite of truth. And that was Durant's view. A myth is often a popular wisdom personified into poetic figures, as the story of Eden suggests, the disillusionment of knowledge and the liabilities of love. Legend is often a fragment of history swelling with new fictions as it rolls down the years. Lewis. So this is Addison Walk. So Addison Walk is what Lewis and Tolkien and I think Dyson walked on September 18th, 1931. After he had his conversion experience, he said, nothing happened during the drive, but my conversation with Tolkien and Dyson had much to do with it. What was that conversation? That conversation was, Lewis, you love myth. Lewis learned Icelandic to read Nordic myth, right? He took myth seriously. He goes, Christianity is myth that really happened. It's a historical fact intersecting with the power of myth. So let me read what Lewis writes about myth. Now, the story of Christ is simply a true myth, a myth working on us the same way as the others, but with the tremendous difference that it really happened. This is really related to the next slide. But we must not be ashamed of the mythical radiance resting on our theology. We must not be nervous that parallels and pagan Christ, they ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. We must not, in false spirituality, withhold our imaginative welcome. If God chooses to mythopoetic and is not the sky itself a myth, shall we refuse the mythopoetic? For this is the marriage of heaven and earth, perfect myth and perfect fact, claiming not only our love and our obedience, but also our wonder and delight. Addressed to the savage, the child, the poet in each of us, no less than the moralist, the scholar, and the philosopher. So then we get to religion itself. Is it imitation? That was Durant, or iteration? So the slides, that's Socrates and Christ, obviously. Over here, the little dots, those are all the flood myths from around the world. And so when you read Durant, he goes, there's like 3 different flood myths in Babylonian literature, right? And so after the exile of 587 BC, a lot of the Bible came together during the Babylonian exile. So the people writing a lot of these things that became our Old Testament occurred within the context of being in Babylon. And so Durant is drawing all of these connections. And so this was Durant's view of religion. Religion begins by offering magical aid to harassed and bewildered men. It culminates by giving to a people that unity of morals and belief which seems so favorable to statesmanship and art. So religion is basically a product of rulers wanting to control you and a way to unify society. But he goes, there must be a unifying moral code, some rules of the game of life acknowledged even by those who violate them, and giving to conduct some order and regularity, some direction and stimulus. In the end, a society and its religion tend to fall together like a body and soul in harmonious death. One of Durant's great quotations, a nation is born stoic and dies Epicurean. And so Lewis and Durant would both agree that religion is foundational. Durant would say that it's iteration, and I won't go through a lot of this, but Noah's Ark, Babylonian, Pandora's box, evil coming into the world through a woman opening the box, echoes of Eve. The Christian communion, tying it back to Dionysus, in the spring you take in the wine and create the spring, right? So he goes through in detail all of the similarities between different traditions in Christianity. And Lewis would find in that synthesis, right? True myth, that it came together, that all these impulses were drawn towards something outside of themselves, which is why there were so many common myths. But this is a huge difference between them. And so then concluding, and then we'll do Q&A. When you think about it, and if you can read the slide, I just wanted to do a table, right? Humans, evolved animals, according to Durant, a hybrid, animal and spiritual. External truth, relative for Durant, divine for Lewis. Morality, relative and situational for Durant, the golden rule, clear for Lewis. Myth, bunch of made-up stories. Lewis, an echo of external truth. Reason, detached. Lewis, synthesized. longing separate from reason. What's beautiful in Durant, this is why they would have such a good conversation. He loved the Psalms. He thought Psalms is some of the best poetry in world literature. He thought the book of Job is one of the great classics of humanity. The figure he most wanted to meet in history is Jesus Christ. He would write sympathetically about longing, but it was detached from reason. Lewis found it a pointer towards the divine. So if you want to think about Lewis, he was pulled by longing, and then he reasoned himself to belief. But you can't remove the pull, that pull throughout his entire life. Traditional religion, essential but not based on truth. Essential and universal. I love what Lex said today in the sermon today, right? That Christ is the good shepherd for everybody, not just his flock. And the Old Testament, imitation and poetic, and Lewis, external truth, iteration, and inspiration. That you can't take out of it the inspiration, the mystic, from actually the happening. So that is it. People are standing up. People are looking at me. I will close. Thank you. And I don't know if we have time for questions or not. Do we? Okay, a few questions. Yeah, Pete.
So John, it looks like, John, that traditional religion is one area that Durant and Lewis had some commonality in, that they both said it's essential. Can you expand on that a little bit? How somebody who would be an atheist would say it's essential?
Because he pattern matched. You know, he basically said we draw our knowledge of history like finding planks in the water and having to reconstruct the ship. But when you go through the expanse of history, civilizations collapse with the decline of their religious orientation. So he went through, in the life of Greece, he started off with Aeschylus, believed, Sophocles, skeptical, Euripides did not believe, and then he tracked that to the decline of their civilization. He did the same with Rome. And so civilizations collapse when the family unit collapses and when they lose a moral structure based on religious belief. I hope he's not right. Other questions? Paul.
Could you get the slide before?
I don't know.
You can go backward? Yeah, well, I don't understand that thing with the fences and,
That's a foundation.
that's what?
It's a foundation.
Oh, a foundation. Oh, okay. Secondly, on the same slide, this for here, and you ask?
You're good.
Oh.
She tells you what to do too.
If Lewis were here, and you ask him, was the flood true or a myth?
That's a good question.
As the Bible portrays it, what would he have said?
Well, I haven't read what he said, so with that as a caveat, I think he would say it was myth. I would say that I would think that it would have happened in some form, as floods happened in that period of time and it was known, but the impact of the animals and their activity and stuff would have had a mythological overlay. That's what I think. I don't think he would have died on the hill that there was two animals and one boat that did this thing, right? I think he would say it was operating as myth. And one of his great frustrations with people criticizing the Bible, such as the creation stories in Genesis and the world not being 6,000 years and all this kind of stuff, was that people did not understand that it was of different genres, that it was poetry, that it was mythology, that it was history, that it was all of these things. And so he would take issues, and did take issues, with the literalist. So he didn't, the great thing about Lewis is he didn't find these contradictions, right? He found the imperfections in the Bible and the contrasts of different stories, such as, who ran to the tomb and who saw. He would say, yes, if you were passing down a story and trying to preserve it was true, by necessity there would be differences. Had it been the opposite, had everything been scrubbed and all the stuff in the Old Testament that causes so much grief, he goes, if somebody were really making it propaganda, they would have gotten rid of all that stuff. And so Lewis, and the other thing I love about Lewis is he never played defense, he only played offense. He would not sit back and get rope-a-doped by a pinker. Any other questions? Yeah, Michael.
So these were all contemporaries, and they were all quite famous. What sort of interactions or correspondence or awareness of each other's work did they have?
I am not aware, and I would love to know that, I am not aware of a connection between them. I do know the reason I chose 1958 or 1959 is that Durant was writing The Age of Reason at that point, which goes up through 1648. And Lewis would have been the foremost expert of literature, at least within England, of the 16th century, right? So their link would have been an academic link of that period of time with those two people wanting to drive in, right? And I think the correspondence would have been a professional correspondence. You know, we're passing through England, would let at the time want to talk about these things. It would not have been, hey, let's go deep on these topics. So an interaction would have been entirely plausible simply based on their intellectual interest. But did they ever correspond? Not to my knowledge. But it wouldn't have been impossible. They must have known about each other. Goodness. Other questions? Yeah.
Like in 3 or 4 words, could you?
Can they be
Okay,
misspelled?
no, could you just say Lewis's worldview and Durant's worldview? Just in a.
Well, Lewis is easy, right? Lewis's worldview was Christian. Period, stop. That's what he said. I mean, if you remember anything, remember that quote. I do not believe in Christianity because I've seen it. I believe in it because I've seen everything else through it. That is a fabulous quote. Durant partitioned all these things. Durant's worldview would be man as an evolved animal whose reason has created great things, but is never far away from his animal passions. You know, he wrote a lot about, you know, we're just this side of anarchy in the animal kingdom. We're on the edge. But I would say a question when I first gave this presentation was asked, which is, if I were a fly in the wall, but could ask a question, the question I would ask would get essentially at what you're driving at, which is, remember that Durant ended his life with this view of the power of grass growing. There's something behind that grass growing. And what's so interesting is that's exactly where Lewis began. Lewis began with the grass growing. And so I would say, and if anybody can find a good Google image of grass growing in a box, let me know. Or coming up through concrete would really be the thing. That's exactly what Durant said. I would say, you know, Dr. Durant, you ended here. This is where Lewis began. What stopped you from walking down that road? And I think what stopped him, and it kind of a teachable moment for all of us, is he had his worldview locked. He had his way of processing. He had these divisions in his mind. Even though he wrote about and saw things contradicting that view, it was framed and didn't adjust over time. And Lewis's did adjust. And it would be that thread of that longing. Could he see pulling on that thread a little bit more? Probably not a question you ask somebody in their 80s, but it would have been the line of questioning I would have had. Any other questions? I think, oh yes.
This is my first time hearing you speak, and I think this is a great university course. Just a personal question. Did you ever teach at the university, any university, on religion?
No, I like to say I have a heavy lifting history degree. I've done a bunch of guest lecturing on business stuff, but I've never done anything on religion. Although I did speak last week at Northwest University for their chapel with, a few hundred kids. And I got to tell you, that was fabulous because, and I had to up my game because, it's an evangelical place, right? And they're just singing, their hands are in the air, and I'm like, I got to follow that. I was about to give a lecture between Will Durant and C.S. Lewis, so I said, okay, I'm going to set this thing over here and try to engage with these kids, and it was great fun. So given an invitation, I would do that. Well, this has been great fun. Thank you, everyone. Appreciate it.